Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new AF chat, and this is going to be a fun one. I have Dan with me, and I've known Dan for many years. Many? Add some more minis because Dan has been around for a very long time and knows a lot about apps. So thank you for joining us, Dan. And we're going to talk about subscriptions.
Sounds good.
But first, as per tradition, tell me where you're from, drop your location in the chat, and tell me what's in your cup. What am I drinking? Earl Grey tea, my favorite, and I did not run out this week, so we're good. In an Appfigures mug. And we ran out of Appfigures mugs, so if you won this, we'll get back to you later. But I'm in New York City. Where are you right now, Dan?
I'm in Denver.
Denver, Colorado. And I'm going to be in Denver next week for 360 iDev. I am giving 2 talks this week. Next week. So that's going to be fun. I've never given 2 talks at a conference. It's always been the one. The one, and then you don't have to worry about anything anymore. And now I'm going to do the one, and then I'm going to have to worry about everything again. It's going to be beautiful. But yeah, again, what's in your cup? Tell us in the chat and drop your location as well. New York City is nice and sunny, I would say. It's supposed to be rainy today, but I don't think that's happening, which is good. And I see people shuffling in, so we'll give some more time. We have one hello from Russia and one from Germany. We're going far today. It's really late, I think, on both sides. So thank you for spending your evening with us. We got coffee, we have tea. It's gonna be good. I usually run out of tea midway through these and completely forget about it. I need like a little teapot next to me. I think that would be nice.
I did a little starter coffee, and now I've got the big coffee that'll get me through.
Coffee 1, coffee 2. Ooh, someone from Cyprus watching us through LinkedIn. We're broadcasting on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter today because we want to reach all the people in all the places. And I see more people shuffling in, but I think we can get started. Ooh, Belarus is in the house. Hello. So for those of you who are joining us now, today we're going to be talking about subscriptions, a topic that I love talking about. We recently had a few people who were talking about subscriptions, and all the feedback from those AF chats from a few months ago, I heard from people that they used and actually managed to make more money almost instantly, which is amazing. So I invited Dan today to talk more about subscriptions, take a short break from App Store optimization, the other way to make money, and really focus on answering your questions, because subscriptions is such a big sort of umbrella term for making money. And there are a lot of, I don't know about umbrella term, but it's a very defined term. But there are a lot of things that go into making money with subscriptions, from how to track it, to how to test it, to how to optimize it, to who's going to do it. And it's one of those things that I think the more you hear from others, the more you hear from people who are experienced, and the more you hear from people who are not and are asking questions, the more you can do better with your app. And that's why Dan is here. So again, welcome, Dan. This is a pleasure. Tell us a little bit more about yourself. What have you done over the last 10 plus years in the app world?
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember when we first met. It's definitely been many years. So I have been in the app ecosystem, or sort of the app economy, whatever we call it these days, really since the beginning. So in 2008, when the App Store launched, I started a consulting agency. It was one of the first in North America focused on building iPhone apps for brands. We had a great run. Apple referred a lot of business to us, as an example, and so we almost never did any sales, right? It was just, we just got to build great products. And so we had all sorts of great customers, folks like the NBA and JetBlue Airlines and so on. And so, and that agency still exists today. It's part of WPP, the world's largest advertising holding company. So a lot of experience building, especially with that company, apps that were or are real time in nature. So, things where there's a lot of data flowing in, TV scale audiences. In the case of an airline, right? The app has to show you whether your flight, if you're checking your flight status, it's got to be accurate and timely. And so we learned a lot about how to build apps like that from a technical perspective, but then also from a user experience perspective. Along that, the kind of the years building that, I was in Cupertino for an event. I think it was the introduction of iOS or iPhone OS 3. That's right. It was called iPhone OS. And I was in the room and two things were announced: push notifications for the very first time. And the big use case there was being able to get your AOL instant messenger messages without having to go into the app. And then the other one was in-app purchases. And this was before, the first round of in-app purchases was just one-time purchase. And really they were focusing on, at least in the presentation, games. So this was years before subscription. But we came out of that event and realized that for all of our app customers in media and sports, and later the airline, push was going to be a really big deal. So I co-founded a company with a gentleman, Joe Pizzillo, called Push.io, and we were one of the early companies in push notification. And we had, again, just absolutely great customers that were huge audience, huge footprint apps that were really trying to do push at scale, blazing fast. So with that company, we ended up at being acquired. We were acquired by Oracle. So Joe and I spent a few years there building basically the mobile marketing engine inside something called the Oracle Marketing Cloud. And that really informs why we started Nami, because we had built this push engine and we had built these apps at scale, but we still saw that so much of just doing all of this required so many dev cycles. That idea that the development team is having to make every little tweak in order to do something new or different. And so, for example, with one of the sports apps, we had this early problem of, well, what if the data feed looks different than what the app expected? Is it going to crash? And so we had to figure out how to solve some of these problems. Anyway, so at Oracle, the thing that we really noticed was that as this was now fast forward 2014, 2015 time period, it wasn't just dev teams anymore. Teams were getting more mature where there's growth people, there's marketing people, there's product people in the mix. And so all of a sudden, the types of tools that need to exist need to be different, and they need to speak to those other personas. And so one of Joe and I, our observation around what was going on with apps at that time, as Apple was starting to sort of push subscription a little bit more, was that all these paywall screens in these apps were handcrafted by developers. Nothing wrong with handcrafting. Things can look awesome. But what if you want to make a change? What if you want to tweak it just a little bit or tweak it a lot of bit, right? It's a lot of work, and you're going back to the dev cycle where unfortunately it means that you're not doing something else that might be a really important priority for the product as well. So that's sort of the origin story of Nami. Is we thought, we got to take these paywall screens and take them out of the hands of developers, because developers want to be focused on those core app experience items. The marketing and growth people want to be able to run experiments and test things and just have agility, marketing agility. And so they don't want to have to go through a slow dev cycle. And so that's sort of why we started Nami, which is a bunch of things now, but at its essence, it's a way to manage paywalls from the cloud. They're fully native paywalls, which we think is really important from the user experience perspective, but they're managed by a CMS. So non-technical people on your team can make changes instantly without, again, consuming those precious dev cycles.
And that's incredibly important. So we put out a developer survey just a few days ago to ask those of you who are using subscriptions, where do you get stuck? What are your biggest challenges? What do you want to do that you can't? And what are sort of the things that are holding you back from making more money? Because ultimately, like I was saying before with subscriptions, it's really about a lot of different things. Price plays into your subscriptions revenue. Obviously, that's an easy one, but also when you show your paywall and how you show your paywall and what's inside your paywall and how often you can actually either test it or change it really makes a world of a difference. And that's one of the biggest problems that came up in the developer survey. A lot of these changes have to do with development cycles, development efforts, and also they have to wait for updates to the app, which is always a whole thing. And in a lot of companies also requires multiple people or multiple teams, which makes it even more challenging. So it sounds like that's something you solve. And let's start with the question. So I am going to take as many questions as I can from the survey. I'm changing them a little bit, morphing a lot of different things that were said into questions. If you have a question, drop it in the chat and we will answer it as we go through. And if not, we'll answer it at the end, depends on how it makes sense. So make use of the chat. Tell us what you want to know about subscriptions. You can go as specific as you'd like. You can go as broad as you'd like. Whatever makes sense for you. We're here to answer questions. And as you can tell from Dan's background, it's not just that he has Nami right now. It's also that he's seen this in so many different ways and worked with so many developers, a lot of really big developers that you would expect the experience would be there to answer as many varied questions as possible. So that's going to be the goal for today. And one of the big questions that I saw in the developer survey, other than the need for something that doesn't require developer cycles, is pricing. Pricing comes up a lot and often. How do I price my app? Should I do an annual? Should I do a monthly? Should I do a weekly? And it's one of those things that are really challenging because ultimately it's about knowing your customers, but how do you get to know your customers? So when it comes to this, what do you think, Dan? Where would you suggest starting when it comes to setting a price and deciding on tiers? Two big questions in one.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that, and this is really hard, but just taking a step back and thinking about what it's like to be a consumer of these things. So for the other apps that you buy, what resonates with you? And there are different types of buyers, right? There's value buyers that are looking for the best deal. There's folks that will pay you almost anything that based upon what it is and the capabilities. So probably the best place to start is just getting a sense of what you feel is what would be appealing to you, but then also that's kind of a qualitative or sort of a opinion based piece, but then go and take a look at the competitive landscape. I mean, most of us are in competitive categories. There's hardly any apps that don't have any competition. So, first step would be how are other people pricing? And by the way, it doesn't mean they're doing it right. It just means it establishes sort of what the market looks like. So in certain categories, a weekly plan might be pretty common. In some categories, the weekly plan might be non-existent. So it kind of can establish at least, keeping the scope of what you're working with sort of focused. Because as you start to think about experimentation, you don't want to have 1,000 different variables. You want to have very few variables to test. So I would start with just what's the landscape in your category, and then just kind of sanity check that against, well, what is your product offering? How do you feel as a consumer when you're buying these things? What would you want to see?
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I like the idea of starting with something. So you're not starting just by looking at competitors or just by really anything else, just by going off of what you think would make sense for this industry. You're starting by understanding your audience. And who better than you to know your audience at the end of the day? You can tell what they want because hopefully you're taking their emails when they have feedback for you. And if not, you're reading their reviews. And if not, you at least understand their buying patterns. And so you understand, when you released a certain feature, you had more updates or upgrades if it's a subscription app, and you know what people like. And then you can take that and you can kind of justify it with competitors. And one of the great ways that you can tell if a competitor is doing something right, because it's very true, just because a competitor priced their in-app purchase or their subscription a certain way doesn't mean it's working, is to look at their revenue estimates. And you can look at their download estimates, and you can come up with an idea of how well are they at converting these downloads to new revenue. And that's something I look at all the time, because it's possible that a competitor has overpriced their in-app purchase and then spent a ton of money on ads. And you are thinking, well, they make a lot of money, but they don't if you look at their conversion rate of downloads to revenue. And that's really what it's all about. And that's really where your paywall comes into play. So if you have a great paywall, you can make a lot more from a lot less. And it's the same thing with App Store optimization. If you have the right strategy in place and you use the right keywords and you follow all the right rules, you'll do a lot better at taking just a little bit of views or just a little bit of search traffic and turning into more downloads, which is obviously the ideal. That's organic growth. So going into paywalls, another question that I saw coming up again and again is, what should I put in my paywall? I don't even know where to begin answering this question because it's so big, but I sense it has something to do with you have to test it. So how would you approach even starting this?
Yeah, well, the first thing is to let's sort of unpeel it for, sort of an onion, or think about what is a paywall. It's not, so let's take a look at e-commerce for a second. And when you go to a website and you buy something, chances are you click a button that says add to cart. And that's the moment that you're sort of making that purchase intent. Now it's in the shopping cart. Sometimes people abandon things in the cart, but let's just assume that once it's in the cart, you're intending to buy it. And the checkout flow at that point is sort of just the mechanics of completing the thing that you were intending to do. So first step is, don't think of a paywall as a checkout flow. Because if it's merely a checkout flow, first of all, you're probably going to lean too much into price and choices between price and plans, and not as much into, well, what's the value proposition, right? The paywall is a marketing asset. So the rule, this is fundamental stuff, but when I was in a 101 marketing class in business school, they talked about kind of the marketing rule of 7. Like, people have to see something 7 times for it to start to register that awareness. And so I think a lot of applications treat the paywall as checkout instead of treating it as an awareness device where you're trying to establish for the user, like, what are the benefits? What's the value proposition here? What are you getting? Kind of creating that emotional connection too, of they make them want to buy, right?
Exactly.
Instead of just like, okay, there's an annual and a monthly, and one's a better deal than the other because we want you to buy the monthly, or I'm sorry, the annual perhaps. And there's not a lot of, maybe there's like one vague sentence about, this is pro, but you're not actually marketing. You're only just putting price in front of somebody, and then that gives them a big opportunity to abandon merely on the fact that they feel like they're being sold to. So that's the first thing, is like almost take price and plans out of it and think about what is the message that you want to send around your paid product. How do you want people to feel about it? And so that comes down to, layout and user experience, background imagery or video, or, all of those creative elements, the words on the screen. And then you can come and figure out, okay, well, how do I want to expose the products, the plans, the price? How do I want to feature certain products over other products? But that's almost like the last step. The first step is telling your story through the paywall.
That's such a good way of looking at it. And you said something early on that I think a bunch of paywalls that I've looked at are missing. You said, tell them what they're getting. And a lot of paywalls that I see do the opposite. They tell them what they're not going to get if they don't continue with the paywall. And that's too many negatives, in my opinion, because if you're telling your story, no one wants to hear a negative story unless it's news, and unless it's a news app and it's the fear of missing out. You're really not going to be able to sell as much this way. So let's say that I am not entirely sure what a good paywall is. The term A/B testing comes to mind. How would you go
Mhm.
about testing story versus features versus pricing? Where would you begin this sort of journey? And I say journey because one test is not going to solve everything, and one creative is not going to solve everything. But if you're really willing to commit to testing, which I think can dramatically, from what I've seen, dramatically increase your revenue, you would take those steps. So
Yes.
where would you begin with that?
Yeah, I would begin with two areas. They are the messaging itself. Uh, I don't think, as much as we talk about layout and creative, I don't think the blue button versus red button test is the first test that you should be doing.
No, not even
Maybe there's
A.
value to that way down the road, but first of all, it's what is your message?
Yeah.
But then there's something else that you haven't mentioned yet, which is placement.
Hmm.
So it,
I
it
was
shouldn't
building up
just
to
be
that.
okay. Well, it shouldn't just be one paywall. It should be different paywalls in different places. And so also picking where you want to test first. Is it the onboarding flow? Or is it a roadblock in your experience where somebody might be motivated at that moment to be ready to unlock that key functionality because they've encountered the roadblock? Those are two very different paywalls where you are going to be testing different things. And so part of the question of like, where do you test first? So messaging, yes, but also the where sort of has to do with, I think, where you are in the subscription optimization kind of maturity model or journey. So, if you're just starting to turn that ASO optimization, starting to see some dividends there, probably starting at the top of the funnel from a paywall perspective makes a lot of sense because you're trying to connect the thing that you've just optimized, the messaging on the storefront, perhaps the keywords that people are using to find you, to sort of the first marketing opportunity that you have in your app. Versus if you go to that kind of deep paywall, deep in the experience, you're sort of missing the connective tissue between what you've just done outside of the app to what you ought to be doing inside the app.
That's just to zoom out a little bit because there was so much that I just heard. One, using multiple paywalls is a great idea. And we'll get into why in a minute because I really want to talk about the differences in when you hit them when they want the app, when you hit them when they have no idea what's going on. And another is start with the top of the funnel. And start with the top of the funnel if the top of the funnel is where you're optimizing. So go after what you're optimizing in the larger scope. And another thing that came up in the developer survey was retention.
Mm-hmm.
And retention, I think, also works with this in mind because where you get the upgrade or where you get the subscription is also how long you would keep it for in a lot of cases, in my experience. So let's go back to bringing the paywall to the beginning of your process where you're optimizing. That's something that came up in a previous AF chat, and there were many comments on this, both in the chat and on Twitter and by email, that says this works. Everyone should be doing this. Everyone should blast their users with a paywall immediately. I don't think that's how it works. So what is your take on introducing the first paywall? Where would the first paywall be for you?
Yeah. Part of it has to do with where do you want to play with intention, have your friction, right? So if somebody's just installed, do you want to have no friction? Well, that sounds great, but now you're not getting them to register, and now you can't follow up with the email to reinforce the value proposition of the thing they just downloaded. Okay, well, so if we're gonna have registration, how do we make sure that it's not so much friction that the all these great downloads we're attracting abandon
Yeah.
because we've made it too hard. So understanding that any one of these things is introducing a bit of friction, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So, for example, having a paywall in the first run experience is not bad if you think about it from the perspective of this is your first marketing opportunity to reinforce first of all, to educate that there is a paid offering in the case of if this is a freemium product. So now you are introducing that it exists. You're giving them an opportunity to convert right there, which some users will. But also you're making it sort of okay for them. You're like, I've seen some paywalls where the little close button is almost the same color as the background and super tiny. So it's like, you really don't want people to dismiss it.
Yeah.
You want them to convert right there. It's like, okay, well, that is a tactic, but from my perspective, the better tactic would be show them the paywall, let them dismiss it, and that's okay. But they're going to encounter it again throughout your experience. Maybe it's different and contextual in other parts of the app. So it's a first messaging opportunity. Now, in some categories, and this is where looking back to the competitive intelligence is really important. In some categories, there's a common pattern that might be different. So, in fitness applications, you almost always have to start a trial to do anything. There's some freemium out there, but it's more rare than in other categories.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Siri.
That stuff is so important. Even Siri wants to hear it. That's how good this is.
Yeah. And then, how does it fit with, for that onboarding example, how does it fit with the other things you're trying to accomplish in onboarding? So, for example, you might actually have some onboarding screens that are really about your messaging and marketing, where then the paywall in that instance is an extension of those things where, okay, well, maybe it is more about plans in that case, because you've just spent 3 screens or 3 carousel swipes on benefits right on the onset. So it's sort of like understanding where the paywall fits with each of the funnels that you're looking at, and then where is registration, and then what are you really trying in each of these opportunities? What is the number one goal? Is the number one goal to get them to convert into a trial, or is it to get them to register, right? And so those are questions that you have to sort of answer and know what you're striving for before you just like pop a bunch of screens up.
Again, so much packed into this answer. So I'm gonna peel it for a quick second. But before I do that, if you like what you're hearing so far, look down below and give this video a like. We're on YouTube and we're playing for the algorithm and your benefit. So give us a like. Let's get to 100 likes. Why not, right? We can do it. I want to keep an eye on those likes. So if I don't see them going up, I will remind you again. Take a pause. We'll do all this. You don't want that. Just give me a like. But back to the answer. So I really like the idea that you said where if the paywall is telling a story, if a paywall is not selling for the sake of selling, but selling for the sake of educating you on what you can get from the app, what will benefit you, what is the value that you as a user, not you as a consumer of the app, not what's the value that I'm going to get as a developer. I'm going to get your money, obviously, but what is your value? What is the one thing you need or the 2 things you need that this is going to give you, and you're not going to have to even think about it twice. And that's really marketing when you think about it, more so than selling. And if you're using that straight up, or if you're bringing that into your intro or your onboarding, depends on what your app does and how it kicks off, that's a really great way to do post-download marketing, which is going to be very difficult otherwise or easily dismissible. And I think the idea of multiple paywalls also really affords the opportunity for not selling as hard to the user. So if you're educating, and this is something that comes up for us all the time as a platform because Appfigures offers so many features, and every time you offer the idea of optimization, it's very difficult to just give you answers. We can't give developers the best keywords to optimize for. We can offer them a few reports that will help them understand which ones are the candidates they should be looking at. But ultimately, there's a lot of art to selling. There's a lot of art to making money with apps, with companies, with websites. And the education part of it is just so important because I know that I have the tools to give you, but you may not understand them at first glance because there's probably 20 of them or 30 of them. And you may not know how to use them, and you may not know what they mean. And maybe the names are a little bit strange, and maybe it's a little bit of jargon that has to do with the industry. So you can try and change all those, or you can try to educate the user over a series of paywalls if you're building them as marketing pages. this is great. This by itself can become a video. And we kind of tying this to something we did a long time ago. A long time ago, we had an AF chat with someone who was doing A/B tests for screenshots for Google. And those A/B tests, obviously for screenshots, which are very different than paywalls, but at the end of the day, when you're A/B testing at scale, when you're A/B testing at a very fine point, you really learn the same things. You learn that you have to test one thing at a time. You have to not think about the very nano experiments of blue versus green, which when I started A/B testing, that was the first thing I started because I figured this is going to change everything. We make the buy button blue and everyone is going to upgrade. Let me tell you, it does next to nothing. No, that's not true. It does a lot in the first maybe 30 to 45 minutes. After that, you leave it on and it does absolutely nothing because there's so much more that goes into buying, and it's the story part of it that really takes the show. So if you are starting with an app as a user and you get to see what the app does and what the app gives you, not what the app takes if you don't pay it, I think that's a really easy way, kind of low, chill way to get started. How many paywalls do you think would make sense for a normal app? And I know that's a vague question, so feel free to define it as you feel right.
Yeah. As many as you can. I mean, really, like if you're thinking about it, okay, no, really. If you think about your website, how many landing pages do you have on your website? Right? If you've cracked the code of SEO and really have got that flywheel working, you don't have just one landing page or two landing pages. You probably have, a couple hundred landing pages.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think about that analog, it doesn't mean you start out with 100. That happens over time, but having that same mindset, I think, is kind of important because historically there's been one. It's been hard coded, and you might experience it from some different places, but by and large, it's like the same. It's the same thing. And I liked what you said earlier about a marketing series, right? So if you think about when I was at Oracle, one of the use cases that they talked about in email marketing was these email marketing waves. So people would kind of flow through, and depending on where they were in the journey, they would get a different sequence, or they would move along in the sequence, and they get a different email that was different from the last one that they got, that was kind of building on what they saw last. And so you could kind of think of this as the same way. So I would kind of look at it two ways. One is that there's probably places in your app where it makes sense. So onboarding, we've talked about the key roadblock opportunities where maybe content or functionality is being gated makes sense. Also, depending on the app and the content and kind of the UI, you might have some inline promotion. So, if you've got, a scroll view with elements in it, and maybe certain items are locked, you could sort of tease it, and then if they engage on that, then you can pop the paywall. Or it could be kind of a different style of CTA where it's not the full screen, where it's some small little unit that's, again, part of that rule of 7 idea, where you're just kind of reinforcing the fact that this thing is there and exists, this paid product. So, and then maybe somewhere in your settings, or just somewhere in your app, you've got a place where they can, there's kind of a reliable place where they can go to see something about the subscription. It might be a dual purpose. If they're not subscribers, it may be an opportunity to get to the paywall and subscribe. If they are subscribers, it may be repurposed as the place they go to cross grade or upgrade to a different plan, or see what the current plan is that they're on, right? So that could be 3. We just talked about onboarding, kind of integrated into the experience, and then maybe somewhere that's more associated with sort of subscription management that you're doing in the app instead of driving them out of the app to manage that in the system settings. So that's at least 3 right there. But we've not even talked about contextualization, where it might be, so if you are a podcast app, you might have a roadblock to certain premium content. and that you could call that your roadblock paywall, let's say. But maybe there's not just one, maybe there's one for every genre of show that you support.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, how many genres do you have? You might have 8 genres. So you've got eight different instances of the roadblock built around the kind of the premium content. But kind of starting small, maybe 2 or 3 makes sense, at least to have kind of the fundamentals in place. And then it's just about creating more and more contextualization around those kind of core placements.
That makes perfect sense. There's a question in the chat that aligns right with this. Do personalized paywalls work well?
And I guess the question is, what does personalization mean?
Let's talk about personalization. And before we even get to personalization, do you think that it's worth spending the effort to personalize paywalls based on what you've seen?
If you're going to go build it all yourself, no. Because it's just a lot of work. Personalization is hard. When we were doing email and push personalization, in-app message personalization down to individual users, doing that at scale is tricky. Doing that at scale where you can both measure the individual level result, but then have aggregation to kind of understand, take the person out of it and see trends around how things are doing. That can be hard. So it sounded quite attractive, and yes, it does work. But the question is the juice worth the squeeze, especially if you aren't leveraging tools that can help you with this? And then the question is, what level of personalization makes sense? I don't think we're at a place where we should be personalizing down to the individual user. With a couple of I think personalization around the life cycle. So for example, if somebody has turned off auto renew and the next time they encounter a paywall is informed by that and gives them an opportunity to sort of be won back into, full auto renew status, right? Because turning off auto renew is sort of a cancel intent.
Yeah.
Sometimes on the annual plans, it's less about I'm intending to cancel in a year and more I don't want to forget that I subscribed to this thing for a year. So I'll reserve the right to subscribe again down the road. But in any event, so I think using the life cycle makes a lot of sense. Going all the way down to personalizing for Dan doesn't make sense at this time. I also think there's some data privacy and sort of price discrimination oriented issues that you just don't want to go there. So then where should you personalize outside the life cycle? I think looking at country level optimization makes sense, right? So you're aligning what you just did on a storefront for a certain country to what you're doing for the onboarding funnel for that country to what you're doing on the roadblock for that country. And it's 100% aligned marketing. So that level of personalization makes sense. And then the contextual, like I just mentioned, around if you've got genres or if you've got content areas or if you've got features, so for example, in a dating app, you might be somewhere in the app where subscribing in that place can mean something to the experience right there, like in that moment. And so then that paywall should be personalized to what you're going to get on the other side right here. And so all of that makes a lot of sense, because if you're the end user, it kind of needs to pass the test for the user of, why am I seeing this? Right? I just tapped on a thing. Why am I seeing this? And the paywall needs to be able to answer that question of, oh, I'm seeing this because I tapped on the thing to see who liked my profile. I'm not able to do that unless I'm a subscriber. They're telling me, hey, to see who liked you, you've got to subscribe. Okay, now there's a kind of connecting the dots nature. The paywall is answering a question. I may still dismiss, may not subscribe, but I at least understand why I took an action and I saw a thing that surprised me, perhaps.
I think that's a valid point. The idea of surprises. I know that many of the paywalls that I look at don't really do that. And so you tap something you want and you don't really care that you need to go through this barrier of upgrading. And if you tell your story properly as the app, I might just say, sure, take my money. I just need this thing. Can I have this thing? Please give me this
Yeah.
thing. And many apps, because they don't do that, because they stop me without telling me why, I think that's a big drop off point. Now, if you have multiple pages and you are getting people from different areas of the app, you probably have another chance at recovering this. And this may not be a total loss. If you only have one, this is a total loss. You're done. And there's just so much competition today. So for pretty much everything, I'll go into the App Store and even Google Play, and I'll type in what I want, my intent. I'll get 10 apps, and they're likely all free subscriptions or something else, but they're free for me to download, so I can at least play with them. And I guarantee you there's probably at least 2 that are really ugly, 2 that are very pretty, and 6 that are somewhere in the middle, where it's a mix of utilitarianism and some design, or a lot of design and some utilitarianism. Really depends on who you fall on. And that comes from big companies and small indies and really anyone in between. So starting with why is really a great way to think about this. Why do I need this? And why do I need to pay you? I don't think that when subscriptions first started, I think there was this big friction of, I don't want to pay you every month. I just don't. Not going to happen. Doesn't matter what you do, who you are. But that evaporated very quickly. And it's such a good business model for developers. It's such a good model even for subscribers, because ultimately you're getting something that's being kept up. And if not, you're not going to pay. So the incentive structure makes so much more sense. Now, there is kind of an extension to this in the chat. Leonardo is asking if we have any tips for subscriptions in apps that are made for kids. And that's a topic that comes up pretty much every time we talk about really everything. The apps for kids are targeting the parents, which makes the experience a lot different. What can you share about optimizing apps for kids?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely tough. You have just number one, you have more complexity around the purchase flow. So, one of the benefits of selling this way is that it's, darn near one click or one tap. As soon as if it's a family organization where the parent has to approve, I mean, I'm not assuming that's always the case, but in some cases that will be the case, and that introduces a different level of friction in the purchase flow. That is something you have to test from a development perspective, make sure that you're supporting that scenario very well. And then the other thing is that that it doesn't, like, do you really want the kid to want to do a thing and then they've got to wait 96 hours before they can,
actually
use it? Like, so maybe there's a sense of, in kids apps, to really think about how you're gating content and not just totally making it a bummer, because ultimately it's, okay, so you got to monetize, right? Got to kind of understand that, but how do you also build you're actually building a brand loyalty, well, not loyalty, brand, like a brand relationship with two parties, the kids and with the parents. And so is it a good experience for the kids, but is also a good experience for the adults? And I would say one of the things that you might contemplate is, as attractive as the one-click in-app billing model is, you might want to support some other models. So allow the parents to go buy on the web and then redeem in the application through some sort of easy mechanism, some sort of code or QR code where you're onboarding the kid in a different way than the traditional purchase funnel. I'm not saying you can only do that or kind of only do in-app billing. I'm just saying that maybe in that market there's a different opportunity. Just like in some of the enterprise apps, on a B2B side, there's your company can buy them at bulk, and then you as the employee get access to them, even though there's an in-app purchase there somewhere. You don't see it. You just get the product. That purchase relationship was shifted to somewhere else. So I'll say I'm not an expert in the kids category. So those are just some ideas that came to the top of my mind. Maybe there's even better ideas.
I mean, we're already getting into some very interesting ideas. Even the thought, when we zoom out all the way, of not selling to the kid, but you are selling to the kid at the end of the day because they're the consumer. They're going to be the ones using this app or game. Even for educational games that you can hypothesize, the parents want their kids to get smarter, so they're giving them great games as opposed to some not great games that exist out there. But at the same time, the kid is still really the consumer of this at the end of the day, and the parent is buying for the kid, or the kid is asking from the parent. So to think about that relationship is great. And also to think about family sharing as a feature that you have to test, which
Yep.
I think is something that most people that I talk to forget. Some
Well, and
people.
by the way, in multiple paywalls, I just thought of another idea, which is in the world of multiple paywalls, why not have a place in the app where there's a placement that says, "Hey, kids, like tap on this to show your parents the benefits." Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's a parental version of the paywall that the kid's making the choice to say, okay, I'm going to tap this. I'm going to go take this over to, mom or dad. And this will do my job for me of persuading them that this is going to teach me math and do all these benefits, and oh, by the way, it's still fun for me. And
Yeah.
but right, so there's things you can do.
I want this. Just give it to me. Oh, it's also going to do all these things that I didn't think about, but someone else wrote and probably A/B tested multiple times.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting approach. I think anything that has to do with kids is always a little bit more problematic because of all the complexity that comes in with it. But it doesn't mean that it's not good, or it doesn't mean that it's really difficult. It's just a different way of thinking about it. And with the right tools, you can actually make sure that you have everything that you need in order to build it. And one of the things you said when we talked about personalization is you said if you had to do it by hand or if you had to do it manually, this would be a huge pain in the butt. And we think about multiple paywalls, and that's multiple things that you as a developer have to maintain. How does Nami solve this? And I think it's very important to understand the tools that are available when it comes to subscriptions, because on your own, it's a lot of work.
Yeah. So how we think about it is informed a lot by our work in the marketing tool space, where you had two ideas. You had the idea of the creative or sort of the marketing thing that the user was actually going to see. So the email, the push, the in-app message. So that's like the marketing asset. But then the thing that was attaching that marketing asset to a person, essentially, or the context of who was going to see it, that was managed by the campaign. And so the campaign is in charge of who sees what when. The designer around the email marketing or the email message or the push message, that was around, okay, so once, what should they see if the campaign selects them to see something. And so in our world, we're doing exactly, at Nami, we're doing exactly the same thing, where there's campaigns that you can set up that really relate back to things like the placement in the application. So you could have a campaign that's your onboarding campaign. Then you could filter that down and say, okay, this is the onboarding campaign for the United States, or this is my onboarding campaign for this other criteria. And then what paywall is associated with that campaign is up to you. And it can be one paywall. It can be two paywalls in the case of an A/B test. It could be even multivariate testing, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend people go to first. I think you got to kind of be at scale and understand exactly what you're trying to optimize before you test lots of different dimensions. But in any event, so really as an app developer, what you are instrumenting in the app is, okay, here's the places that we're going to launch one of these paywall campaigns. And then once you've put in those couple lines of code around kind of the placements, then from there on out, you're out of the mix. You as a developer, you're done. You get to go work on other stuff. And now what the non-technical people on your team can do is say, okay, here's all the campaigns that are active. Now, what do I want to associate to these things? What is the execution step? I want it to be, paywall 1, 2, 3, 4, or I want to have an A/B test. and then you can change those out. And then separately from that, you have a paywall CMS that lets you edit the specific paywalls that either are attached to a campaign live in the real world, or are new ones that you aren't showing to anybody yet, but you're going to start building some ideas. Maybe you've cloned the last one and say, okay, we got to take another crack at our marketing messaging. We're going to start with what's working well now, but we're going to improve. So we're going to duplicate and we're going to update our messaging. And then when we're ready, go back to the campaign and say, okay, now point from paywall A to paywall B, hit, go live. And from there on out, that's that campaign, that placement for that targeting rules will show the new alternative.
And all this is done without updating the app itself. So once the developer puts it in, those changes can be done directly from the CMS, the content management system, without any sort of shenanigans.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the only time you'd need to go back to an app update is if you're going to introduce kind of an entirely new area of your app, and then you want to maybe have a whole new campaign managing that section. So it's more of like a once in a blue moon thing than every time you want to make either a little or a large tweak. So by decoupling, I think the high level idea I'm trying to say is like we try to decouple the paywall with the code.
Yeah.
Because if the specific paywall you're trying to show a user in any of those places that we talked about is tied to code somehow, then if you want to change that, you got to change the code. So to have an abstraction layer that says, okay, your code should talk to these kind of control objects, the campaign, and then from there, the paywall, somebody else is going to manage what paywall is associated to those inside of a web interface.
That makes a ton of sense. And I think from an implementation standpoint, that's really the only way to do it, because I'm looking at the chat and I put a little poll in the chat asking how many of the viewers have multiple paywalls versus one. And 69% of respondents say no multiple paywalls. And that's because it's complicated. And that's because also, ultimately, eventually, it will become technical that you will forget to update some text on some paywall, and then it will pop up in your app, and someone will say, oh, this makes no sense. Or you'll forget about a feature. So maybe the opposite of this is there a reason not to make changes constantly? Is there a reason to slow changes and really think them through as opposed to say, I really like this award, to go in and change? Because it sounds super simple at this point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. And the answer is that you really want to have an intent behind the change that you're making, because just making changes might make you feel good, like you're making progress. But if there's not a rationale behind it, then all it is trying to make you feel good that you're doing something.
Exactly.
And that's the case in all these things, right? In ASO, okay, I changed my keywords, I feel good, it's going to work, right? But what was the rationale behind the keywords that you changed or the changes you made to the storefront? So, and that's, by the way, back to the competitive intelligence thing. That's the thing that's sometimes lost, is your competitor may have arrived at an answer that's built on many layers of learning. And by the time they got to the current solution, they've got all this knowledge that's built up against justifying why they're doing what they're doing now. And if you just copy what they're doing and don't have the true understanding of why, then you're not going to be building learning from there. You're going to just essentially being, continuously monitoring what they're doing and reacting to it. So it's really important that you think of these things as small chunks, and the goal isn't every single chunk is going to turn into revenue bliss, right? Every single change isn't revenue bliss. It's this change I'm going to make. What is it going to teach me? And is that something I want to learn? And if not, then do a different change. So that's really important. It's that learning process over time that's really going to drive the results. And more importantly, is the over time part, your ability to test rapidly, doesn't mean making a change every microsecond just because you can. However, if you don't have the ability to test fast, then you're slowing down your rate of learning to whatever rate of testing that you can do. So you want to be in a position where you can test very fast, but that doesn't mean just test everything all the time. Just, okay, today I got to feel like I'm doing something. So I'm changing that button color. Finally going to do it.
Oh, yeah. But is it going to be green or yellow? That's the question.
Well, it might be red. Sometimes it's got to be pink.
Let's make a multivariate test on a color. Yeah, I mean, that's really a great point. And oddly enough, I don't know if you got to read the keyword teardown that I released earlier today, but really has an example of one app that copied its competitors and is not doing as well, even though it should be. If it followed the rules, it would do better than the competition because they only copied what they could see, and they didn't really copy the essence of the strategy of ASO. There's probably one mistake in there that's costing them first place, which is just, to me, that's insane. We're talking about very simple things. So yeah, this makes a ton of sense. And I mean, ultimately, it also goes back to you have to understand who you're talking to, and that will inform a lot of those decisions on what to test and how to test. And from my knowledge, and I've built many A/B testing systems in my life, not something I ever want to do again. And if you're thinking as a developer, oh, it's easy, it's not that difficult. You randomize a thing and you attach it to a user and then you just show things. Maybe. That's not A/B testing. That's just one tiny part of it. It's the analytics and it's the learning. It's the bringing all that learning together that really teaches you what you need in order to make more money. And if you want to go in and make things and do things, that's great. But if they don't have a purpose, you're not going to make more money. And that's what this AF chat is about. So that's kind of my own experience at doing this for so long. Now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and like, be honest with yourself around a self-assessment of where you're at, because it may feel good to run a test, but if you don't have if you don't have enough traffic to get to statistical significance in a timely fashion, then you need to be focusing on the funnel, not focusing on the downstream paywall optimization.
And that's exactly a question that Leonardo put in the chat just now. How do you test when you don't have a lot of traffic, or how do you test when you know that you don't have a lot of impressions to get to statistical significance, the measure which you would say, yes, this would work consistently? And that's the best answer I've heard so far. I've heard answers along the lines of try for longer or try simpler test. But really, when you think about it from a business perspective, and that's the benefit of having Dan's years of experience on here, don't worry about the A/B test. If you don't have enough impressions, it's probably irrelevant. Go up and try to get more impressions first. That is just beautiful. We are running out of time, so if you have any question, we have 2 more minutes to drop it in the chat now. Now is the time to do it. The number of people who responded with a no has dropped a little bit since I mentioned the poll in the chat, but we're still at more than 50%. So if you are not using multiple paywalls, I think my takeaway from this AF chat, among the many that I've taken notes, I don't know if you noticed, but I've been taking notes because I want the timestamp so I can put them in the video later. Use multiple paywalls and target every paywall. Use it as an opportunity to educate and market, but also target it to what's happening at that particular point in time. Is a person new to this? Tell them everything that the app can give them. If the person has shown a specific intent, maybe it's a feature or a value that comes from several features, show those. And make sure that they understand why they're seeing the paywall to begin with. And all that you can do with Nami without having to code it by hand, and without having to think about having to code it by hand, and without needing developer support for this. So thank you, Dan, for joining us. This was great. Anything else you wanna end with?
Just, I think there's so much opportunity around this space in optimizing and being on a journey of sort of optimize and getting to that revenue bliss. Like it actually is possible, but it's not, there's not just one answer to all these things. It really is sort of about establishing the right, foundations. And sometimes that's tools. Sometimes that's, how you're approaching problem solving and learning and building your own knowledge. And people that are experts in the field, they didn't become experts overnight. I mean, that's built over time. So really just don't be afraid to start working on it, working on the problem and breaking it down into pieces that make sense, and trying to find tools and partners that can help you along the way.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I know you're working on a guide, the ultimate guide for subscription optimization. And
Yeah.
when that's out, we'll make sure we share it with everyone who joined us today. That's not out yet, right?
Not out yet,
Okay.
but our goal with it is to do a couple of things. One is to help you self-assess where you're at. And then based upon that, help to point you in the right direction of, okay, here's the next three things you ought to be thinking about. Here's how you achieve those things. And then once you're done with that, here's where you go next. So we want to create kind of a roadmap for optimization, because the thing we hear often is, I don't even know where to start.
Yep.
And so we're trying to help solve that problem.
That's really the same thing with App Store optimization. Once you get started, it's a lot easier to understand where to go next, but it's that 0 to 1 that's really challenging and really overwhelming and really intimidating in many cases.
Yeah.
So as soon as that guide is around and as soon as that's something that users can actually tap into, we'll make sure to share that link in this video and also in our other emails. So if you haven't already, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you like this sort of content. I do this once a month with a guest and once a month without a guest. So there are a lot of opportunities to learn and go from 0 to 1, or like my last live stream, go from, I think, 7 to 100. Depends on how you look at advanced optimization tips. So that's pretty much everything we have. If we didn't get to your question, drop it in the comments below this chat. I'll take a look at those comments later, and hopefully Dan will too, and we'll get back to you. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day or evening or night. It was a pleasure. Again, thank you, Dan, for joining us. If you want to learn more about Nami, there's a link in the chat. We'll also leave a link in the description as well, so you can go and try it out and really kickstart your optimization for your paywalls plural, because you need a bunch of them. That's it. Take care, everyone.